Well, my goodness, you just had 3 keynotes this morning already, didn't you? It is a pleasure to be here. I just want to say thank you to Laura, to Neil, to Shayla, and the rest of the leaders, Amber, who's been so gracious, and logistics with the team at Merck, for this invitation to come to NCBIO, to come back again to a town, I say town, a city now, that is near and dear to my heart, Durham, North Carolina. A special thank you to my colleagues from Merck, Marlene, who has been shepherding me around and was so instrumental and helpful for me when I came last time. And then also Amanda, we have known each other more years than she could probably count. I am so very, very proud that she is the leader of our Durham facility. And a little bit of history is here. John Wagner. John and I have known each other for a very long time. We were part of the leadership team that was the makeup of Durham when it was just on a piece of paper, walking around West Point, Pennsylvania, and talking about this wonderful opportunity that we have in Durham, North Carolina. And so it was originally Durham, it was supposed to be 150 people. And now it is blown up to how many, Amanda? 1,100. So talk about expansion at its best. And the work that we all do in saving and improving lives in this community across the globe and across the nation is a spectacular one. It is needed, and we are all blessed to be a part of this community. So I wanted to take the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it is a journey that we are all on, and I am so pleased to be here to talk about this journey. We know that we are in very, very perilous times, very challenging times, with all of the things that we're seeing, the social political climate across the globe, the war in Ukraine, all of the different things that are happening in this nation, the divisiveness. Every single issue seems to have points of view from all over and representing different communities of people. And it's very challenging, but because of that challenge, diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're at the forefront. They are extremely, extremely important issues because all of these issues surrounding them are issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to continue to be an impact, to play an impact around the world and the business landscape. It's just going to continue to grow. Why? Well, over the past 2.5 years, who would have thought New Year's Day, 2020, that we would be thinking in just 3 short months, our worlds would drastically change. We would be shutting down borders across the globe. We would be shutting down work in offices, and people would be having to work from home if you weren't an essential employee. We had a different definition of essential employees as well, didn't we? It was our frontline workers at the front of all of this crisis. But one of the things that we also learned during this time of separation was that we had to learn to work differently. And as we are coming at the end, we hope, not the end, but a different normal, as we move towards that, we have to learn that, we have learned that there are different ways that we need to be working, and we need to be acknowledging that. The impact of leaders and managers. We know that all of us need to be leading and managing in a very different way. Our workforces are more dynamic, they're more empowered, they're more enlightened, and they want answers, not just from the standpoint of their functional skills and capabilities in our business performance, but also what is it that our companies stand for? And leaders, you know, the words of that open door policy that we used to have and still have in a lot of different areas, that means so much more in this day and age. And managers and leaders need to be prepared to be able to engage in those conversations and that dialogue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And not saying that they need to be all knowing, because it's impossible to be able to be all-knowing when it comes to various different cultures around the globe. But they should be having a spirit of learning and empathy and listening so they can be able to create that inclusive environment that we all want within our workforces. The responsibility of companies is expanding. It used to be, especially in our industry, we're a very conservative industry. It's talk about our business, don't talk about anything else. We treated employees as if they were going through a car wash. And what I mean by that is there are so many things impacting us in our communities, impacting us in our homes, the stress of it all. And then we're expected to sort of walk through the doors of our companies like a car wash and just shred our identities, that stress that's coming from our communities and our families, and walk in and be productive. And in this day and age, that's simply just not possible. We are dealing with all kinds of different things across a myriad of different issues, depending on your identity, how you identify, across all of the dimensions of diversity. And we can't just shake that off when we come into the workplace. And so we want to make sure that our companies support us in those struggles. And also too, in the labor market, we all know that there's a war for talent, especially here in the Carolinas. We know that we want to make sure that we're creating an environment where the candidate is the customer when they're interviewing and they're seeking a company that they want to call home. But in this day and age, those candidates want to make sure that the companies that they're going to share the same ideals and beliefs that they do as individuals. And so they're asking those questions in the interviews about what the company's stands are across diversity, equity, and inclusion, ESG, all of those different things that you might think, wow, okay, I thought they would have just asked me about the science. They want to know about the company's values. And so companies as social activists and corporate activists, that question and that conversation comes up a lot. And we have to look beyond what we do on a day-to-day basis from the standpoint of our business and expand that. I can tell you over the last 2 years, 3 years, I have been involved in more investor relations calls than I can count. Over this year alone, over the last 3 months, at least 20. And the investors are asking those questions around what the company's stance is around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our shareholders are demanding it, our employees are demanding it, and the investors are looking at that too as another criteria for who they might want to spend their money and that funding with and support. And then the impact of equity. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but that is playing a role as well when we think about diversity and inclusion in our workforce. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But we have to take a holistic approach when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It isn't just about counting numbers of people in seats or in your organization. That's still a very foundational aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is the definition of diversity. It's differences that we can see and differences that we can't see. But we want to make sure that we're taking a holistic approach by how we look at that and ensure that it's embedded into the lifeline, into the value chain of the organization. And so that means making sure that you're looking at it from the standpoint of integrating it into all of those different areas of the organization, government affairs, into your commercial and your sales and marketing, your research. How are you looking to make sure that there are diverse people that are taking part in your clinical trials? Do you have that infrastructure in your organizations? Are your commercial organizations, your sales and marketing organizations looking at not just the marketing strategies, the sales strategies that really hit those people at the top of the distribution curve, but what are they doing to make sure that they're integrating social determinants of health? What are they doing to make sure that they're thinking about health equity? What are they doing to level that playing field with our patients around the globe so there isn't the haves and the have-nots, that everyone can avail themselves to the services, the products that we provide? So you have to really look at the lifeline of the organization to really make sure that you're integrating diversity and inclusion throughout that. And then also You also want to make sure that when you think about your employees, that you're integrating it also and embedding it throughout the life cycle of the employee, from the moment before they come into the organization, when they're a candidate looking to come into the organization, through the onboarding process and how you onboard them. How are you making sure that they can feel welcome from the minute that they step through the doors? How are you making sure even before then, your candidate selection process? Are you going to fish in different ponds? In other words, are you still going to the same schools? Are you still going to the same newspapers and putting ads and also the technology, the social media? How are you expanding your horizons and widening the screen and the aperture to where you are sourcing your candidates? How are you onboarding them? Do you leverage your employee resource groups, your affinity groups, to welcome people with open arms into your organization? How are your managers helping to onboard them? Or are you just sort of dropping them in the deep end of the ocean and saying, okay, we brought you into the company, there you go, live and learn. But we want to make sure that when we are onboarding our employees that are coming in, that they feel welcome, that they feel belong through that process. We don't want it to look very differently from how they were recruited and the company was talked about to how it is when they get in. And how are we looking at our development processes? Are we looking at them to make sure that everybody, regardless of what they look like, how they learn, how they view things, where they come from, but we're treating them all differently and helping them to aspire to get to where they want to go from a career point, from a functional skills and capabilities, but whatever it is that they aspire to do, we should have the tools and the resources to be able to enable that, regardless of their dimension of diversity and how they identify. Assessment and performance. Are we making sure that we don't have unconscious biases that are playing out and manifesting themselves in how we assess our employees and how we evaluate them? Are you running assessments and looking at different metrics and analysis to see if there's any bias that's built into the system and how that is happening through your performance processes? And then also advancement. Many of us, especially in our industry, we want to make sure that we are, looking at our sourcing strategies and making sure that we're bringing in people from all different walks of life and all different dimensions of diversity. But how are we making sure that we're advancing them? How are we making sure that we're looking at the criteria for promotions and advancement? How are we looking at succession plans to make sure that diversity, equity, inclusion is built in there? And then knowledge sharing as well. We know that there are multiple generations in the workforce now. And so they all think about things differently, not to stereotype different generations, but there are some things and attributes because of the time that they were growing up, what surrounds them in their communities. There are some differences that do tend to link to certain generations. And so we need to make sure that knowledge sharing, especially in our business, that we're making sure that we are sharing that knowledge across generations, across the different dimensions of diversity, so everyone knows and understands the business that we're in. I can remember years ago where we'd be in meetings and everybody would get up and we'd take a 10-15 minute break and we would be debating something in a meeting and everybody, well, let's just take a 15-minute break. And we take a break and the guys would go to the men's bathroom, the women would go to the women's bathroom, and back 25 years ago, the one or two women that were in the room would go to the women's bathroom. We all come back and evidently there was some meeting in the men's room because when we came back, all of a sudden everything was solved. And so, those things, it's sort of like the proverbial corporate golf course. But those things, they happen. And some of those challenges existed. And so we want to make sure that there's complete knowledge sharing, that it isn't a point of the guys going to the bathroom and figuring it all out and coming out and then just telling everybody else what's going to happen. We want to make sure that we are sharing knowledge through our learning and development programs, through also not just formal avenues, but also informal avenues. In the example that I just gave, talking and sharing information, because a lot of us didn't grow up where we had a mother and a father or aunts and uncles who grew up in corporate America, who grew up in the biotech industry. We weren't that advantaged. And so we had to learn on our own and get mentors and those individuals to help us from that perspective. When we got into the organization, we weren't born with that proverbial biotech spoon in our mouths. And so we need the extra help sometimes to learn and help us to understand where the landmines are in the organization. And many folks, they have that because they've been talking with people even before then at the dinner tables and having conversations around that, or having conversations around stocks and bonds and things like that. In my household, you were just lucky to get your hands on the greens and the ham just quickly. That's all you were worried about. You didn't worry about conversation. It was a conversation about what happened at church that Sunday and what was happening with the trustee board and all of that. That was my household growing up. We didn't have conversations about corporate America because we didn't know anybody who was in corporate America. My father was a teacher and a principal. My mom was a domestic engineer and COO of our household. And so we didn't have those opportunities, but I knew that there was something else out there because my parents, that's one thing that they tried to expose us to, either through television, sitting down with us to watch the news and sharing some of those things and just trying to widen our experiences beyond what they could afford to do. And that is something that I think many just take for granted, the fact that they have those opportunities that many don't. And then even transition. So you say, well, Celeste, when someone's retiring or when they're leaving the organization, why should we care about them anymore? In this day and age, the war for talent is very, very serious. And so you've heard of the boomerang effect, that you want to make sure that when an employee leaves your organization for whatever reason, that they leave and you have a class of alumni who are proud to have worked for your organization and would speak very highly, even though they're not there anymore, but they speak very highly about their time and their experience at your company. That's what you want. You want alumni who are very proud to have worked with you, regardless of where they work currently. And then the reason why you have to look at your organization and embed diversity and inclusion throughout all of the different departments and areas of the company, to also making sure that you are looking at the lifeline and the cycle of the employee, you have to do both, and you'll see the benefits. And let me talk to you a little bit about the benefits. And I believe, we got past the fire drill. That was 9:30. None of you care about that because you didn't have it on your phones. I didn't hear the noise. But this is the reason why. What we call this, I call this the employee ripple effect. And this is the reason why it's so important that we understand why it's important to focus on your employees, because it will have an impact across the globe. And so at the center of this, it's sort of like when you throw a pebble in a pond and it creates that ripple effect. So if the employees are at the middle, at the center of this, if we surround them with a culture of inclusion, psychological safety, make them feel wanted and belonging and empowered and energized to be able to do what we want them to do every day, which in all of our business is about saving lives and improving the lives of patients. If we surround them with what's in that blue, with that culture of inclusion, it will reap the benefits within our organizations. We will have stronger marketing strategies. We'll have innovation in our science and our technology. We will have better strategies when it comes to our sales colleagues. We'll have better technologies when it comes to our manufacturing practices. And all of that innovation, that creativity will be unleashed in our business. And then further, the ripple effect will happen externally with our shareholder value, with our pipeline, with our marketing and influence and the value that we're bringing to patients, the policies that will impact. We'll be the employer of choice, but it will create that ripple effect that will just benefit both internally within the organization and, very importantly, externally to our patients and that ecosystem that's out there surrounding our patients and our businesses. And so that's what we call the employee ripple effect, which is so important that we create that environment within the organization and also embedding DE&I within the employee lifeline. Let me talk a little bit about equity. People will ask me, Celeste, what keeps you up at night? You're the head of diversity and inclusion for this organization. What is it that most of the time keeps you up at night? And what I say is the work that we're doing around equity, it's causing disruption in our workplaces, but it absolutely needs to be done. This work is not for the faint at heart. And I'm sure many of you have seen this illustration. The first illustration with the people, all three of the individuals standing on one rock. But you can see that the first person on the right, the person on the right can't see, that is your right, yes, your right. They can't see over the fence, even though they're still standing on one rock. The second person in the middle, they can just barely, heads a little bit over the fence to barely see. And the person on the left can see very clearly over the fence. Now, the work that we do in equity is in the middle illustration, putting those rocks in place. Those rocks represent actions of equity, so we can make sure that everyone can see over the fence. And that fence represents all of the isms that exist in our organizations and in society: racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, people who chastise people because of their faith, people who chastise people because of their disability, all of those different isms that exist, systemic issues. That's the fence and what it represents. And then the rocks are those actions of equity that we have to put in place so everyone can see over that fence. And so what's happening, what keeps me up at night at this day and age and where we are with this journey around diversity, equity, inclusion, is the fact that that person that's standing on one rock in the first illustration and is standing on one rock in the second illustration, well, they're looking to their right and they're looking at the person standing on 3 rocks and looking at the person who's standing on 2 rocks, and they're asking the question, well, how come they have 3 rocks and they have 2 rocks and I still only have 1? They don't understand that that fence is there because they've always been able to see over it. It hasn't manifested itself in the different inequities that exist with the person that's standing on the right, the 2 persons standing on the right. And so we put those rocks in place, those women's leadership programs, those diverse leadership programs, the different ways that we source for candidates, the different programs that we put in place, those bells and whistles that we put in place, those audits that we put in place to make sure that there's no disparate treatment in the organizations. You can name a lot of those different programs, but we put those rocks in place so people can see over the fence. But it has to be a multidimensional approach. We have to tear down the fence, tear down those systemic issues. We have to put those rocks in place. And we have to explain to the person who's been standing on that rock in the first illustration and the second illustration, why that fence is there, that the fence is there, how it's manifesting itself to the other people who need those rocks in place. Because the voices are being elevated, not just the voices of those that have been historically oppressed, but all voices have been raised and elevated. And we see that more and more and more across our nation, especially, and across the world. We see the different voices, and people do not necessarily feel like they have to be politically correct anymore. And so you get the questions in town halls and conferences when you do the Q&A, audience Q&A, and they say, well, you know, I think sometimes putting these programs in place, putting employee resource groups in place, isn't that really exclusion? That's not inclusion. Again, they don't recognize and acknowledge the fence. They don't acknowledge the fact that these rocks, employee resource groups, They need to be put in place so people can feel a sense of belonging and community within their workplaces, so they can be allies to others who don't identify the same as them. So these things are coming up, and the things that keep me up at night are the fact that we need to make sure that leaders, ambassadors for change and diversity, equity, and inclusion, that they have the courage of their convictions to be able to speak up and meet that person who's standing on that one rock where they are and have that conversation and that dialogue and educate them and do it in a way that doesn't cause, doesn't leave them without any dignity and respect. That is assuming good intent, But we are able to have those conversations and those dialogues so we can get them to see that there's a fence there. You may not have been able to see it throughout your life, but it's there. And let me tell you how it looks to me. And let me tell you what some of the limitations are to me as a Black woman, or as a person who is disabled, or as a person of Muslim faith, and on and on and on. That's what keeps me up at night. We all have to play a role to be able to create the environment of inclusion that we want to see in our respective organizations. And if we don't have the courage of our convictions to be able to speak in those times of adversity, then it'll be challenging. And so our leaders need to make sure that they understand the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion. And Amanda said it so very, very eloquently this morning when she talked about one of the actions of equity is around the 110 vision. And I applaud Merck, and I applaud all of the companies in North Carolina that are doing this body of good work for Blacks who have experienced challenges and gaps when it comes to employment and being able to be gainfully employed and put food on the table for their families and clothes on the backs of their families. And so this is just an example of an action of equity that I'm very, very proud that our former CEO and current executive chair, Ken Frazier, working with our colleagues from IBM, that this was their vision to be able to do this. And those of you that have ever read anything about Ken Frazier or know Ken Frazier, you know that this is a passion of his, education, and him coming up from Philadelphia, the south side of Philadelphia, and growing up in the son of a janitor who made it to law school and made it to become one of the few Black CEOs in this country. He wanted to show a vision for those of us that growing up, we didn't see that in the small towns that we grew up in. And so this is an example of an act of equity, the work that is going on. And I applaud any of you that are currently a part of 110 and have taken that leap of faith in helping in this initiative. But the last thing that I want to say before I close out is around having the courage of your convictions. I implore to you, please continue to press on, continue to press forward through all of the challenges, through those anxiety attacks, through those things that keep you up at night when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Don't be afraid to elevate your voice, because when you elevate your voice, you're elevating it not just for yourself, but you're elevating it for thousands of others who have not yet found the power within themselves, the courage within themselves to elevate their own voices. And so if at any point in time you feel like, well, it's just me talking and no one's going to listen to me, and what can I say that's going to add any value? Always know that it's the power of one voice that speaks up, that speaks on behalf of others in their community. It's so very, very important, especially in this day and age where people don't have the courage to do that. It's so important that we do. And by your presence at this conference today, it tells me that you definitely believe in this. You believe in the work that we're doing in diversity, equity, inclusion. Your allies, your ambassadors, your change agents. And I want to encourage you to keep going, keep pushing in your respective organizations, because together we're gonna just raise the landscape around the biotech industry, around the pharmaceutical industry, And we're going to be an industry that is going to be a role model to other industries across the nation, across the globe. People will be looking at us and saying, look what they're doing, not just to help patients, but also look what they're doing around diversity and inclusion to create an equitable environment. So with that, I want to say thank you again for the invitation. Thank you for having me, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.